welcome to the CEC Report. It's July 13. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, a powerful British faction aligns with LaRouche on Glass-Steagall. Unemployment, what can you do in 20 million hours? And finally, the ACCC and Productivity Commission, enforcers of economic fascism. So first, a powerful British faction has aligned with LaRouche on Glass-Steagall. Now, following on from what we reported last week, Craig, with these LIBOR developments and the scandal around Barclays Bank, that we touched on then that people in Britain were starting to say, all right, enough's enough, we need to go the full hog to Glass-Steagall. None of this ring fencing idea that Lord Vickers came up with as a cheap alternative.
Yeah, well, just for people who don't know, the LIBOR rate is the London Interbank Overnight Rate, which is the rate at which banks lend to each other, the interest rate. So this is a very important rate because you're talking about, literally something in the vicinity of $500, $600 trillion just in derivatives trading alone that's governed by this rate.
The rate is the reference for. And they've been able to set it at will, instead of the market, this magical market setting it, which everyone wanted to believe. It was how the market really operates. Shady backroom operators just setting it what they wanted to be so they could skim off profits. Yeah. So now this has come out, of course, right? And
well, it's come out, the nature of the banks. This is, they're in a gambling environment. They're trying to make as much money as they can, and they're just literally illegally ripping off everyone.
So what's stunning is the calls for Glass-Steagall have now gone right to the top. And by that, two people to name. One is Lord Minor. Now, Lord Minor is he's a former government minister under the Gordon Brown government. He was the financial services minister who was responsible for liaising with the City of London. And of course, the City of London is a separate entity in British politics. That's this medieval arrangement, right, where they're sort of outside of the authority of most parts of the British government. So this Lord Minor was the liaison to them, and he was made a life peer as a result of his work in government. He has called for Glass-Steagall, most emphatically. Peter Hambro has called for Glass-Steagall. Now, Peter Hambro is one of those lesser known, people know their names like Rothschild. This is just as significant as Rothschild. This is one of the top echelon oligarchical families of Great Britain, the Hambro family. He has called for Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, he actually had a very hilarious commentary on this because obviously his whole banking experience has been under the Glass-Steagall type reforms of 1933 onwards of Roosevelt. And he said, look, the problem is the bankers today don't have the balls necessary to be able to make money like we used to. Now what he's meaning, that's a rather crude term, but what he's saying is that when under Glass-Steagall you have the separation of the banking system, the commercial banking system, with the merchant banking system. Now he's a merchant banker. So when you're a merchant banker, you can only use the funds of that merchant bank. You can't use your depositors' funds unless that you have specific permission.
And you eat your own losses.
And that's what that means. When you make decisions, you have to have the balls to make the decisions necessary to make money, which means you take a lot more risk. Now these days, he's saying the bankers can play with the depositors' money, get into speculative instruments which they can lose, as we've seen many times over, and consequently the entire system suffers. So he's calling, ironically, let's go back to a system which has got more balls in it, in the sense that you've got the merchant bank separated from the commercial banks, and we'll have a much healthier system.
Yep, exactly. And the other point is that he was saying that nowadays, when everything goes wrong, the bankers can expect to be bailed out.
That's right.
And because they're, quote unquote, too big to fail. Financial Times, one of the other main flagship publications in Great Britain, has also emphatically called for Glass-Steagall. So Lyndon LaRouche, who's led the global fight for Glass-Steagall since the global financial crisis erupted, because of course LaRouche was the first to call it as being underway, he has jumped on this and made the point that finally you're seeing the British have decided that they want to survive. Because as we said last week, this is not a hiccup in the financial world. This is the greatest financial crash, economic breakdown, collapse in world history. And these people are taking it quite seriously. Now, contrast that, Craig, to this week, very extraordinary event actually. The CEC's Queensland State Secretary, Jan Pacullis, attended the Gillard government's community cabinet meeting in Ipswich, and you can make appointments for 10 minutes to meet with a minister. Jan chose to meet with Wayne Swan, the federal treasurer. And in that meeting, she effectively gave him a 10-minute lesson on Glass-Steagall. Now, he wasn't happy because we are the CEC. As soon as he didn't realise it was a CEC meeting with him, as soon as he saw it was, he slumped in his chair like a sulking schoolboy, according to Jan. But she took her full 10 minutes. When they tried to shut her down early, his aides, she said, no, I've got 10 minutes and I'm going to take him. And Swan agreed, she can have her 10 minutes. And she gave him the whole picture on Glass-Steagall and these developments coming out of Great Britain. And she actually got him to make some sort of feeble concessions, if you will. He actually said he supported Glass-Steagall. I'll come back to that in a minute. He admired Franklin Roosevelt, and apparently he's got a big portrait of him on his wall. And he was no lover of the Queen. That's what Swanee said to Jan. But of course, Jan called him out because when he said he supported Glass-Steagall, his idea of Glass-Steagall was the Paul Volcker rule in the United States, and that's not Glass-Steagall.
No, well, that's completely supporting the whole concept of speculative banking, because what the Volcker rule was, and it's been endorsed by Obama, was basically to stop what's called proprietary trading by the banks, where the banks couldn't use their own funds to compete in speculative instruments against their own customers. So we're not talking about getting rid of the speculative aspect of banking and bringing banking back to what it really should be in the sense of the Glass-Steagall. We're talking about preserving the system but just tweaking it a little bit. And of course, as you've seen with this ring fencing idea in England, it's not going to work because the banks can't help themselves in this sort of situation.
And the other thing that proves Swan wasn't telling the truth is that the Australian government during the whole GFC have been a very strident voice on the international stage demanding that, say, the countries of Europe go with the bailouts, go with the austerity, etc., which is the opposite of what the spirit of Glass-Steagall is. Now, Craig, the thing I wanted to highlight though, and this is from something LaRouche said, that now the Brits are embracing Glass-Steagall, they will want to dump Obama.
Well,
what do you think of that?
Well, that's the only way that we can actually get a Glass-Steagall. You've got to take the world's biggest economic power, which is the United States, and if they move with a Glass-Steagall, then, and there's a lot of support for Glass-Steagall in the United States, then this will reform the entire world's financial system. Well, not reform it, it'll actually ditch the existing system of globalisation and free trade.
Well, there were two bills. There's a bill before the US Congress now on Glass-Steagall, the HR House Resolution 1489 Macy Captor's bill. But there have been two previous bills that have been put up on Glass-Steagall since 2009, and in both times the British threatened the Americans about the passage of those bills. And since then, Obama has been the main obstacle to the passage of Glass-Steagall.
The casus belli, they use the term specifically, which means cause for war. This is what the British oligarchy was saying. Now you have the real leaders within the British oligarchy. I mean, the oligarchy is very divided on many things, Robbie, but they also have, in a sense, a division of labour. So what you have here is Lord Minor, you've got Peter Hambro, you've got the Financial Times. This represents, in a sense, the financial leadership of the oligarchy coming out and saying, if we don't go with Glass-Steagall, we're finished. So there's a sort of self-preservation going on here that, and Obama's up against this. I mean, when the British oligarchy, or the oligarchy in general, can see that their entire system is going to fall apart, and you see one very weakling president in the form of Obama standing in the way, you can see the Brits are going to move whatever assets they have inside the United States to push for this sort of a policy.
But also, and to those who are wondering what say the British can have over Obama,
they put him in there in the first place. I mean, the money that came through the Cayman Islands and the whole inter-alpha group banking system to find the funds to get him elected. George Soros's foundations and so forth. We've documented this in great detail right through the Executive Intelligence Review publications and so forth. Look, Obama, as we say, is a British puppet. He's put in there specifically to push the British financial oligarchy's line. That's now being seen to fail, and therefore they have to get rid of Obama if they intend to save themselves.
All right. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about the real story of unemployment in Australia. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So now, unemployment. What can you do in 20 million hours? So this week, Craig, the official unemployment rate came out, and as usual, it was a lie. according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics official figures, the rate rose from 5.1% in May to 5.2% in June, which is it's a rise in the rate because jobs are being lost. Something like 27,000 full-time jobs were lost, 6,000 part-time jobs were created. Right, so that was the unemployment picture according to the official statistics. Now that's a 0.1% drop in employment. 0.1%. Remember that figure. Because compare that to this figure. Instead of counting the number of people who worked, count the number of hours worked for the whole month, across everybody for the whole country, right? Aggregate hours worked in June in Australia was down sharply from May by 1.2%. Total hours, which comes up to 19.6 million hours less worked, right? Nearly 20 million hours. How can you lose 1.2% of total hours but only 0.1% of total jobs?
Well, I don't know how that's possible, Robbie, but I was just thinking as you were talking, we now have in Australia a service economy where there's about 60% of people employed in service industry. Now, if you took 20 million jobs out of factories, right, that would represent a real collapse in the physical...
20 million hours.
20 million hours, sorry, not jobs, but out of factories, you would have a real drop in employment. But if you took 20 million hours out of bankers, accountants, and so forth, that might be a net gain. I don't know.
You're saying fingers crossed. Let's hope it's the right jobs that are losing hours.
Yeah,
okay.
not the manufacturing jobs. I mean, but they're shrinking, day by day too.
Well, let me explain something technical to the viewers. The Australian Bureau of Statistics figures are based on a broad survey over the phone conducted each month, and the survey asks 3 questions. And it depends on the answer to all 3 whether your candidate is employed.
And that's a bit like political questions when they do it. Do you vote for the ALP, Liberal or Greens? They never ask, do you vote for the CEC?
No, that's right. So here's the questions. Have you worked 1 hour this week? If the answer to that is no, the next question is, if not, have you looked for paid employment every week for the last 4 weeks? If the answer to that is yes, then the final question is, if you found a job, would you be available to start this week? And only if the answer to that is yes, are you unemployed.
Oh.
You are counted as unemployed. If the answer to any of those questions is different, you are not counted as unemployed. Now, the Roy Morgan Research organisation who does polling, they have a different poll they conduct every month. Now, their poll does not ask, are you looking for a job? They just ask, have you worked? Now, they do count like part-time, right? So they don't make that distinction. They still say, if you've worked an hour, then you've worked. But just by not asking, have you looked for a job, their survey captures all those people that have given up looking, right, who are still unemployed, and their figure for unemployment is 8.6%, significantly larger. And then even the Australian Bureau of Statistics has a different measure of the economy called the broad underutilisation rate of unemployed and underemployed based on the way they count those, and that together is over 12%. So if the Roy Morgan guys did that underutilisation rate, they'd probably be in the 17% range, right? And the real figure, that's where we're getting to. The people who are watching this show would relate to the real figure of unemployment in Australia because they're out there. So, Craig, are these the figures of a strong economy?
Well, Robbie, they're statistics. I mean, they can be manipulated and turned around, turned on their head. The statistics themselves mean nothing, but what you've got to look at is the directionality of these statistics, which they can't hide. It's going up. It's 0.1%, from we were saying 5.1 to 2. It's going up. Now, the fact is it's lies. It's not, from what you've said, it's completely not true. Well, what else do we have to look at? Look at the total mix of the economy. As I said before, 60% of the economy is involved in service activities or similar. Now, that actually to any physical economy is classed as overhead because you're not producing real wealth. And in terms of LaRouche's physical economics, you've got to say, well, what are the productive parts of the economy? The manufacturing sector, the agricultural sector. What's happening in those sectors? They're dying. As we see every day on news reports, more and more manufacturers are being put out of work. Family farms are disappearing. Actual family farms, not corporate farming, but family farms are disappearing. So when you look at the unemployment figures, they only represent a very weak shadow of the reality of what's going on in the Australian economy. And the problem is, one, the mix. We're getting more and more into a service-based economy, which is a disaster. And secondly, the lying that goes on. I mean, I think you could close to double what's going on here, Robbie. Somewhere between what the ABS is saying at 12% and double that figure is somewhere around the real figure.
Well, what do we hear virtually every day now on the news? And it's like no sector of the economy is spared. The latest one this week is Darrell Lee, for crying out loud, the chocolate factory. Myers has just announced another 100. It's just every day you're getting these announcements right across the economy.
Yeah, this is because we're based on a serviced economy. We're not interested in the real issues of developing our fundamental physical economy, of producing things these days. And we've got very much used to this over the last 40 to 50 years, and it's a real problem.
And just briefly, what would we do to get people back to work in a hurry?
Well, you have to begin processes of putting tariff controls in to protect our own local industries, that which is left, so you can reinvigorate manufacturing, go with national banking to support manufacturing, providing the credits necessary to expand that particular sector. We'd have a whole program for agriculture to keep and provide incentives for family farmers. Take the debt burden off with debt moratorium, that sort of thing. I mean, we have a whole raft of these sorts of policies which are outside the normal free market ideas, but they actually support the real physical economy. That's why they work, yeah.
All right. Okay, we'll leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about how the ACCC and the Productivity Commission are enforcers of economic fascism. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, the ACCC and Productivity Commission, enforcers of economic fascism. Fascism, as you know, Craig, is basically the private dictatorial control over an economy, and it goes back to the Mussolini days. That's the essence of fascism is economic control, right, in the hands of private financiers. And what we have is an economy where that is enshrined so that the needs of the people are always being subdued by certain bodies, so that the markets and the banks, etc., can get away with murder. And the two I want to talk about today are the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and the Productivity Commission. So the ACCC, it's been talked about a lot because of the carbon tax. The government has announced that they've got a carbon tax and they've modelled it. And the modelling says there's only going to be $9 per week price impact per household. That's all. And so there's no way that's right in the real world at all, because when you have a tax that makes the price of energy go up, that permeates absolutely everything. And so this is a stupid model, but they want to make their model come true, and the way they've decided to do it is they have unleashed the ACCC to terrorise small businesses into being too scared to jack up their prices to accommodate this tax. So there'll be no passing it on to the consumer.
Well, I'd like to make a point here, Robbie, about this carbon tax and say energy production, right? The problem right now in Australia is that we have a deficit of energy production. We also have a deficit of investment into future energy production because of the carbon tax. Now, they model this, they're saying, oh, let's put these parameters into a computer and let's see what we get. How can you actually model who is going to invest in the future of the electricity industry in Australia based upon the fact that the risks now are so great in terms of what their potential returns are? I mean, this is the insanity of modelling. So therefore, this whole prediction is based not upon any concern for the physical well-being of the people who have to pay for the electricity, but it is part and parcel of the nature of this financial system of monetarism that we're in to maximise the profit of private concerns. So the ACCC, as you're saying, is the enforcer of this.
They get to enforce this unrealistic view of the world, right?
Yes.
And the small businesses get terrorised by it, which of course has been the history of the ACCC. We won't go into it in huge detail, but while they've been enforcing competition policy on small business for 20 years now, Coles and Woolies have literally got away with murder and become the biggest duopoly in the world. And every time they've been challenged in front of the ACCC said, oh no, that's competitive, right? It's a small business that gets crushed by them.
And the other thing that's sensitive for people too is petrol prices.
Yeah.
And that story has never been told. I mean, we were told by someone that they could pull oil out of the ground here in Australia for something like $5 a barrel. And now it's $100 a barrel in the world market approximately. Yep. Work that one out. Why are we paying these huge prices? Why haven't we developed more of the Australian oil industry? And this has all been sat on.
One thing to understand about the ACCC, Craig, is it was set up by Macquarie Bank. Macquarie Bank designed national competition policy. They set up the ACCC. They ran it under Graham Samuel, who was a Macquarie Bank executive for many years. And in the case of the carbon tax specifically, Macquarie Bank is a pioneer of privatised electricity and carbon trading. Right? So that's the ACCC I want to talk about. Productivity Commission. Now, the Productivity Commission used to be known as the Tariff Board. And in the 1960s, when John McEwen, Blackjack McEwen, was protecting Australian industries, the Tariff Board got a guy in charge of it named Ralph Radigan, and he started leading a counter-attack against McEwen to start insisting on free trade. And over the years, the Tariff Board has gone from being called the Tariff Board, it was then renamed the Industry Assistance Commission, back when there was still an intention to assist industry. Then it was renamed the Industry Commission, now it's the Productivity Commission. And the Productivity Commission has recently said two things. One, that the government should no longer assist industries like the car industry because that's corporate welfare. Now, it's all right to have, they never question corporate welfare for banks, but for the car industry, why? They say that the mining boom is now permanent. That's the future of our economy, the old Paul Keating line. We should be focused on being a raw materials exporter, and those other industries get in the way. So the government is doing our economy a disservice by propping up the car industry. Now, what this does, of course, is the government doesn't want to prop up the car industry. They're scared of the electoral backlash. This gives them an excuse not to, right? Oh, we've got to listen to the Productivity Commission. Today, the Productivity Commission has said that the labour force in Australia is uncompetitive, and they've got to remove uncompetitive practices, which means trade unions. You can't have trade unions anymore because they're going to be uncompetitive according to the Productivity Commission. Well, this is fascism. That's the first thing that Hitler did, was get rid of the unions. If you get rid of unions, slave labour and austerity, here we come. They might be crook. The unions might be crook, Craig, but the principle of unionism is a principle of the general welfare. So they're both stinking organisations. What do you think we should do about them?
Well, I think you've answered that question, Robbie, by what you said. Look, they represent the financial oligarchy. They represent the system of free trade, of globalisation, and protecting mechanisms in order to enslave the population under these policies. This is British free trade. This is what British free trade has always done. This is why the British, had the slave trade and the opium trade. This is part of their philosophy. So consequently, when you see bodies like the ACCC and the Productivity Commission, they're just following the policies that they're designed to set up. So obviously you've got to abolish them. McEwen had the idea of tariff control, which was very effective because under tariffs you protect the local industries. Things cost more, but yes, they cost more in the sense of the fact that we have access to more goods, more services and so forth, and we're not competing with labour at 20 cents an hour, 20 cents a day or whatever in places like Bangladesh. And you see more and more material these days is not coming from China, but even more broken down countries like Bangladesh, particularly in the large Coles, Woolworth owned stores.
And the home brands and things. The McEwen was interested in preserving Australia's living standard. These organisations are interested in preserving the integrity of a market, which means the people who get to profit.
Which is the banks.
All right, well, we've run out of time again, but thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more of the CEC Report.